Her voice was known to millions, but when she became inconvenient, she was simply switched off. Maya Krystalinskaya disappeared from the screens, not because she stopped singing, but because someone from above placed an invisible seal. Undesirable. Why? What was so terrible about her for the system? Only one person, who held a high position in the television hierarchy, said a short, cold phrase about her. And from that moment on, all doors were closed. You will hear this phrase closer to the end. She sang even when she was forbidden to raise her voice, literally with burns on her neck from radiation therapy, with a scarf hiding the traces of her struggle, with a diagnosis from which people did not survive. She didn't ask for pity. She went on stage and sang, but she was cut out, erased, and silenced again and again. What for? You will find out why her last love ended on the floor in a hallway and what happened afterwards. Why did she run away from the man she had long considered her salvation? And why did her voice never sound on live air again, even though people continued to ask with letters, voices, and hearts? Stay with us until the end, because the most important thing is not on the surface. The most important thing is what she didn't get a chance to finish saying. She was born into a very ordinary family. She had no famous last names or creative dynasties behind her. Her path could have been predictable to the letter. School, university, work, a vacation once a year, and a radio in the evenings. And everything was indeed going according to this scenario. The Moscow Aviation Institute, a future as an engineer, and a job in a design bureau with charts and blueprints. But even then, it was noticeable that something about her didn't fit into the neat lines of formulas. During her lunch break, she would hum over her tray, and in the evening, she didn't rush home like her colleagues, but headed to the Central House of Art Workers, where music, not the tapping of a pencil on a ruler, was heard. She was drawn to where her voice was more important than her profession. There, she joined an ensemble with a gentle, almost poetic name, The First Step. The name turned out to be prophetic. Rehearsals lasted until night. Someone would miss a note, someone would forget the lyrics, but for her, it was like air. In this whirlwind, a man appeared for the first time who saw more in her than just a girl with a sincere smile. Yuri Saulsky, a young composer, heard her voice. Not loud, not virtuosic, but alive, touching, as if carrying within it a feeling that could not be taught or acted. He suggested she sing a song in Spanish just as an experiment, and when she began to sing, the hall held its breath. There wasn't the slightest accent, as if the language were her native tongue. It was then that Saulsky first thought, this is a real find. But the most important moment came when Moscow was preparing to host the World Festival of Youth and Students. The country needed to show the world its openness and musical freedom. And so, even jazz, which was considered almost subversive, suddenly became respectable. Saulsky was tasked with putting together a jazz orchestra, a symbol of modernity and cultural flexibility. And the first person he turned to was her, the quiet girl from the design bureau, whose voice, as he himself said, breathed with heart. Rehearsals were a secret joy. And then came the day of the performance. The hall greeted her voice with a standing ovation. She sang in Italian, and the listeners didn't just applaud, they didn't want the song to end. She received a silver medal at the festival, and at that moment, it seemed that the stage had opened up for her forever. But the excitement was short-lived. A few days after her triumph, an article appeared in the press that hit her where she was most vulnerable. The newspaper, Soviet Culture, criticized the group with such coldness, as if it were not about youth music, but about subversion. Special attention was paid to her. She was called out for flailing on stage, contrasting her behavior with the canons of restraint. In a country where overly bright emotions were considered almost indecent, her artistry became a reason for a reprimand. Saulsky's group was disbanded, and she was not forbidden to sing, but was given a clear message: no more foreign songs, no more freedom. She did not cry, did not make a scene, did not knock on closed doors. She just continued to sing. Not because she was sure she would win, but because she couldn't do otherwise. Her voice was not a talent, it was a part of her being. And then, at the very beginning of her journey, when the doors were just beginning to close, she realized, The stage in this country is not a path to fame, but a constant battle for the right to exist. And yet, she made a choice, not to leave, because even in that silence she heard music, and even behind deaf walls, she felt the audience respond. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not in the speakers of the main halls, but it was her path, and she took the first step. The voice that gave the audience goosebumps was not a cause for admiration, but a warning signal for those who watched, to ensure that emotions did not go beyond what was permitted. In the Soviet Union, anything that seemed too personal, too bright, too real, was perceived as a danger. Her singing was not just a musical number. It was as if it opened a crack into a life where one could feel for real, and that was already considered a challenge. Jazz, on the wave of which she first ascended to the big stage, was music with an ambiguous reputation. It was allowed but with reservations, with a squint, with apprehension. It was too free, too Western, too uncontrollable. And when her performance in foreign languages caused a storm of applause not only in Moscow but also in the international press, it did not become a reason for pride. On the contrary, it caused annoyance. Why does an artist from the Soviet Union sing as if she grew up in Rome or Barcelona? Why are her gestures, facial expressions, and stage presence as if they are from another world? The audience saw it as artistry, but the officials saw it as a violation of the unwritten rules. After the publication of the devastating review, everything changed. Her performances stopped being scheduled. The songs she was allowed to sing were chosen without her participation. There was not a single open prohibition, only a cold silence. She was under unofficial surveillance, as if her too delicate voice could disrupt the marching harmony of the ideological choir. And yet she continued, not out of stubbornness, but rather from the same quiet dignity that would later define her whole life. She did not cry out about injustice, did not seek patrons, did not fight for airtime. She just went wherever she was allowed to sing. Every performance was as if under a microscope. Too sad, not the right format. Too emotional, too Western, too real, too dangerous. She felt this earlier than others, that here, the one who feels the song best would not win, but the one who knows how to fit it into an approved template. And that was not her way. Salskai's group was disbanded. He himself almost disappeared from sight. She was left without an orchestra, without jazz, without foreign lyrics, but with a voice that was still looking for an outlet, with a voice that needed not only space, but also a listener. And even when her songs began to be replaced by others, even when it became clear that the system did not like those who sounded different, she did not let it make her quieter. On the contrary, she began to sing even more cleanly, as if proving that even within a given tonality, one could convey everything: pain, tenderness, faith. It was then that she realized, it is dangerous to be bright here. Here, talent is not always salvation. Sometimes it is a sentence. And yet, she chose not to leave, because she knew that not every voice sounds for a long time, but a real one always remains. He burst into her life easily, beautifully, with a joke on his lips and a theatrical gleam in his eyes. Arkady was young, charismatic, and witty to the point of audacity. Against her internal restraint, he seemed like a fireworks display, a spark that suddenly ignited in the midst of gray weekdays. He would fall to his knees right at concerts, make scenes of declarations, as if he were acting in a play where she had the main female role. Everything happened quickly: meeting, proposal, a stamp in the passport. It seemed as if they were a perfect match, both from a creative environment, both in love with the stage, both looking for their place in the world. But very soon, the colorful facade cracked. What seemed like a game at the beginning became a daily routine, where behind the jokes lay sarcasm, and under the mask of cheerfulness, irritation. He, who dreamed of fame, often took it out on her, ironically, sarcastically, as if testing where her patience ended. She, who was used to keeping everything to herself, more and more often retreated into herself, into the silence that had no place in their apartment. There was no support in his judgments, no tenderness in his courting. Everything became more and more demonstrative, and she felt less and less loved. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This union was falling apart. Even friends didn't immediately realize that everything was over, because the breakup was silent, without scandals, without loud words. She only once confided in a friend about a gypsy who had predicted a great but short love for her in her youth. With a bitter smile, as if she wanted to erase what had become a mistake, but couldn't. After that, a pause came in her life. Not in her career, not in her songs, but in her feelings. She decided, no more haste, no more flashes behind which there is nothing real. It's better to be alone than to hope again for something that will turn out to be a game. And even though the silence of the evening seemed cold, there was more truth in that silence than in empty embraces. She chose not loneliness, she chose authenticity, and everything that would happen to her later would be built on that choice. He appeared quietly, without fanfare. He just happened to be there at a time when she was no longer expecting anything but peace. Slender, intelligent, with soft facial features and eyes that read as attentive, not thirsty for admiration. He didn't throw words around, didn't make a scene, and perhaps that's what won her over. It was easy to be with him, as if she had found someone who understood without a lot of explanation. Against the backdrop of exhausting tours, feigned fuss, and a cold stage, he seemed like a quiet harbor she could return to without fear of being ridiculed or misunderstood. She began to believe again, but she was in no hurry. She held her feelings close, like a fragile cup, afraid to spill them. They were seen together more and more often, in theaters, at premieres, in restaurants. They seemed like a beautiful couple, as if they had stepped out of a book illustration, an artist and a journalist, both reserved and deep, as if made for each other. And for a long time, it really seemed to her that she had finally found it. But behind the outward calm, disturbing shades began to appear. He could be attentive, and the next day, cold and aloof. He would be silent without explanation and get annoyed at trifles. She tried not to notice, made excuses. He's tired, he's busy. It was just a bad day. But one day, the mask slipped. She walked into his office at the editorial office unexpectedly and saw something that was impossible not to understand. Empty bottles, a glazed look, a crumbling shell. What she had mistaken for mood swings turned out to be an addiction. Not to work, not to love, but to something that was slowly destroying him from within. At first, she tried to be there for him, talked to him, tried to persuade him, believed she could pull him out. But with each new relapse, with each belated apology, it became clear. This was a fight without a victory. Drunken scenes in restaurants, flashes of anger, tears, and empty promises. This was no longer love, but a shadow of it. She realized if she didn't leave now, she would stay forever. And in that forever, there would be no respect, no self. She left without a shout, without an explanation. One day, she simply packed everything that connected her to him into a suitcase and took it to the attic, as one takes things that once seemed necessary, but now only remind one of pain to a dusty space. From that moment on, her songs changed. They became deeper, heavier, as if each note bore the imprint of what she had lived through. She didn't talk about it out loud, but on stage, everything was visible. Her voice became a little lower, a little hoarser, but it resonated with a truth that was impossible to fake, and the audience felt it. They didn't know exactly what had happened to her, but in each of her verses, they suddenly recognized themselves. At first, it all seemed like nothing, a slight weakness, a hoarse voice after touring. The temperature stayed a little longer than usual. She attributed it to overwork, the stage, travel, lack of sleep. But time passed, and the small things stopped being small. Lymph nodes on her neck began to swell, as if her body itself was trying to say something was wrong. She tied a scarf, first as a style element, then as a mask. Scarves became her companions, soft, silky, of all kinds, but always with one purpose: to cover the traces of what was beginning to destroy her from within. When the doctor looked at her especially carefully and said that she needed to get a checkup urgently, she still hoped. It was just a cold, maybe a virus. But the diagnosis from the clinic sounded like a sentence: Hodgkin's lymphoma. A disease that few people talked about out loud, but everyone knew it didn't come for a day or even a year. She was only 29. She held the paper with the diagnosis and couldn't understand how it was even possible. Just yesterday, there were tours, the stage, applause, and today there were medical terms, a a schedule of procedures, and a ban on singing. The ban sounded especially harsh. Any strain on her vocal cords was a risk. The question was not about her career, but about her life. And in response, she said only one phrase: "Then you'd better kill me right now." Because for her voice was not just an instrument, it was everything. To be silent meant to disappear. She did not agree to the role of a patient. She refused to be just a body on a hospital bed. The therapy began, scorching, agonizing, and debilitating. She had to hide the burns on her neck under new scarves, tying the knots more carefully each day, so that no one would guess that there was a net of burns under the fabric. But she continued to go on stage as if nothing was happening. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusted her hairstyle, tried her voice, which was a little hoarse, but still hers. Rehearsals did not stop. She was not seen in a hospital bed, but was seen in halls, singing, smiling, alive. And this was a real challenge, not to the disease, but to the system, to herself, to the silence that tried to cover her. The scarf became her armor, her image. Women all over the country began to tie their scarves the same way, imitating her, not knowing that they were not copying a fashion, but a gesture of survival, because she was not just hiding her burns, she was hiding her pain, but not in her voice. There, on the contrary, everything, and even more, now sounded. When the stage opened up to her again after a long pause, it seemed that the worst was over. The disease had receded. Her voice sounded with its former purity, albeit with a new shade of depth. People were waiting for her songs. Letters came in sacks, and records sold out instantly. But in the world she lived in, the love of the audience meant nothing without permission from above. Her songs became audible again, but not where the artist's fate was decided. Television, which used to look for subtle lyricism in her voice, suddenly fell silent. She appeared on air less and less, without explanation, without reason. She simply disappeared. Instead of calls from editors, there was silence. Something was happening behind the scenes that was impossible to prove with documents. She didn't fit in. Her last name wasn't right. Her nationality was too noticeable. Formally, there were no decrees, but everyone knew. With the arrival of La Pen at the helm, the air became tighter for those who did not fit the ideal picture. Maya didn't fit because she was herself, and that was enough for her name to be crossed out. Not openly, but subtly, quietly, as if by accident. It was especially painful when her performance was cut from the final edit of Song of the Year. It just wasn't shown. The song was there, the recording was there, the audience's reaction, but on the air there was emptiness. She didn't ask, didn't complain. She just looked out the window and remained silent. This silence became her only form of protest, not to break, not to fight, but just to keep singing, no matter where it was. And she sang in houses of culture, in parks, before movie screenings. There were no orchestras, no directors, no prompters, just her voice and those who came to hear it. Sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. No one told her how to act, what to say, or which verse to cut. No one filtered her. And that's why the audience came to her, because they knew she wouldn't pretend, wouldn't be cheerful if she wasn't, wouldn't sing a cheerful song if her heart was heavy. Her songs did not entertain. They opened internal windows for those who had long not dared to look at themselves. Editors called it whining, pessimism, and unsuitable intonation. But in those lines that they cut, the audience heard the most real thing: nostalgia, pain, memory, farewell. And this was scarier than any protest, because even without loud words, she said more than was allowed. The stage that was left for her was modest, but on that stage, she sounded freer than ever. Not because she was allowed everything, but because she had nothing left to lose. And in that shadow where they tried to drive her, she became even brighter, without decorations, without broadcasts, without tinsel. Just a voice coming from within. And people were drawn not to a star, not to a name, not to a cover, but to a person who knew how to talk about the main things in a whisper. He appeared when everything in her was already saying, "It's not worth waiting, hoping, or letting anyone in anymore." Behind her was fatigue, pain, disappointment, and a fear that was hidden deeper than all: being rejected again. She was famous, but not fashionable, loved, but forgotten by television, with a disease she had learned to hide. with a last name that was a hindrance, with a voice that no longer sounded in capital halls, but in rural clubs. It would seem what new could happen. But it was at that moment that she met Edouard. He was different, not from the stage, not from the studio, not from the world where everything is decided by applause. He was an architect, calm, attentive, an adult not by age but by tone. He looked at her not as a singer, not as a woman with a past, but as someone he simply wanted to live with. She was initially wary, embarrassed by her diagnosis, her tours of district houses of culture, her tired body that no longer hid the traces of the struggle. And yet, she said to his face one day, "Why do you want me? I have cancer. I am a Jew. I sing in clubs." He just nodded, as if he had heard something unimportant. He didn't run away. He came back again and again, not intruding, not demanding, just being there, making tea, bringing books, and talking to her as a person, not a role. And she began to thaw, not quickly, not all at once, like the earth in spring, first a drop, then a stream. He didn't make grand gestures or give promises, he just acted. He looked at her in a way no one had before. He accepted her whole, with eyes filled with sadness, with burns under her scarf, with a past she couldn't forget. They got married in the summer of 1973, without fuss, without announcements. From that day on, her life stopped being a fight for recognition. She cooked dinners for him, ironed his shirts, and smiled in the mornings. For the first time in many years, she felt that being at home meant being herself. He didn't make her a heroine, didn't push her to the stage, didn't plead with her. He just took care of her. She later told her close friends that only with him did she understand what real love was. Not theatrical, not public, without screaming, without breaking down. He just held her hand, and that was enough. They lived together for 11 years. 11 years of silence in which the most important things were heard. There were no concerts at the Olympic Stadium, no new broadcasts, but there were evenings together, conversations about books, walks, a look that said, "You are mine." And in that silence, she finally understood that happiness does not require an audience. It comes when you stop waiting for it and stays until everything ends. They were going on a trip. Summer was just beginning, and the suitcase was already half packed. She sorted through her clothes, put aside books, and thought about the warm air, walks by the water, and a short break from everything that had accumulated over the winter. Edouard felt a little tired, but he didn't complain, as always. And yet, one morning, everything changed. He turned pale, his fingers trembled, his words became slurred, and then silence fell. A silence that makes everything inside you clench. He just lost consciousness right in the hallway, without words, without a glance, as if the sound had been ripped out of the room. She called an ambulance with trembling hands, fumbling with the buttons, unable to feel her legs. He was taken away without any explanation. She sat on a bench in the hospital corridor for 5 days, not eating, not sleeping, not calling anyone. She just waited, stared at the walls, and prayed to herself quietly, concisely, as if she was afraid that speaking out loud would frighten away fate. Every day the doctor came out with the same words. His condition is serious. There are no changes. She listened and continued to hope. But on the 6th day, it was all over. He passed away without opening his eyes. His heart had given out. The illness he had never talked about seriously had finally caught up with him. She returned home to the very house where she had been happy. But now it was just a space. The same walls, the same cups in the kitchen, the same smell on the pillow. But there was no longer the sound of his footsteps, no evening light in his eyes, no him. And the house turned into emptiness. She walked silently, breathed but did not live. The song in her was cut short. Her friends tried to support her, to pull her out, to bring her back to some kind of rhythm, but every day she retreated further into herself, began to slowly lose weight. Her movements became clumsy, first an arm, then a leg. Her body was reminding her of itself again. The disease had returned, but this time she did not fight, because there was no one left to clench her teeth for, to get out of bed for, to go on stage for, to put on a scarf for. She did not complain, she just whispered sometimes, when she had the strength, and more often just remained silent, as if she was retreating inward where his voice, his warmth, and his tenderness were still preserved. When a person loses their support, they don't fall immediately. They just stop holding on. That's how it was for her. And this slow, almost silent decline became her way of saying goodbye to the life they had built together. The spring of 1985 was quiet. Nature outside the window was awakening, as always. But in her room, her own winter reigned, slow, transparent, almost painless. The voice that had for decades touched the most delicate strings disappeared. Not all at once. First it became quieter, then hoarse. Then it just stopped sounding. She could no longer speak, only whispered individual words, and sometimes just nodded, conveying everything with a look. That warm, familiar, slightly narrowed look in which there was more life than in speeches. Her body weakened with each passing day. Simple movements turned into efforts. She never complained, never allowed herself to be a burden on others. She was cared for by those who had stayed by her side when the airwaves were silent. Her younger sister Anna, her loyal friends with whom she had shared childhood secrets and stage fears. No one talked about the illness. In those walls, there was no place for despair. They read books to her, brought her favorite Linden tea, and turned on old recordings where her voice sounded as if it was still with her. She listened and often smiled. A smile became the last language with which she communicated with the world. She knew that her time was coming to an end, but she was not afraid, did not ask for another day, did not cling to life. Her face showed acceptance, not capitulation, but a calm agreement. As if everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be lived had already been lived. She asked to be taken to the hospital, simply and without drama. A few days later, her consciousness faded and her eyes closed. She left as she had lived, with dignity, without pathos, almost unnoticed. But in that inconspicuousness was the very strength that made her special, not a star, but real. When it was all over, there was no silence in the room. Music was playing in it because even the silence she left behind was filled with a song, her last one, without a voice, but with a soul. When her voice fell silent, it seemed that she would disappear with it, without concerts, without screens, without ovations. But time passed, and it became clear that Maya had not disappeared anywhere. She was not on the posters. Her name was rarely seen on television programs, but her songs continued to live on. Someone would put on a record to remember their childhood. Someone would hear her voice from a radio in a bus and freeze. Someone would pass her recordings down from generation to generation, not as a rarity, but as something alive, real, and truly valuable. She never strived to be an icon, either in her clothes or in her behavior. Her style was simple: scarves, velvet, a calm gaze. But in this apparent modesty, there was more character than in the most expensive outfits. The scarves, which in time became her symbol, were not an element of her image. They covered burns, traces of the struggle, the very vulnerabilities that she did not display. She hid her pain so as not to bother the audience, but she did not hide her soul. It resonated in every note. Maya did not play a role on stage. She went out and sang the way she felt. Her songs were not entertaining. There was no frivolity in them, no easy forms. Only the essence, only the truth. This truth is what made her beloved. People were drawn to her not because she was brilliant, but because she was relatable. In her voice, they recognized themselves with sadness, warmth, and a pain that few dared to name out loud. She didn't ask for attention, didn't change her last name, didn't leave, didn't try to return to the center. She just continued to be, and in that, there was something stubbornly real. She did not become an icon of the stage, and that is precisely why she became an icon of the heart. One that lives on in memory, not because of achievements, but because of the feeling that you have heard something real. When her "and finally I will say" sounds, the room becomes quieter. Because these are not just words. This is not just a song. It is a presence. And as long as it sounds, she is there. Every one of her songs did not begin with a note, but with a breath, the same short inhale before a phrase in which emotion was already heard. She didn't put on a show, didn't create numbers, didn't gesture wildly. Her performances were reserved, almost motionless, and that only made them more powerful. She didn't try to impress. It was as if she was simply sharing with those sitting in the hall, with those listening in solitude, with those who turned on her recording at night to get through another day. She didn't act out passion. She relived it. She didn't portray sadness. She just opened her heart. In every line, in every pause between words, more was heard than in dozens of memorized speeches. She didn't shout, didn't pour her soul out on live air, but when she fell silent, the audience froze because that silence carried weight, because the quietness between the verses was filled with meaning, as if she was leaving space for the audience to feel it themselves. Her strength was never in fighting for airtime. She didn't knock on doors, didn't demand justice. And yet she was the one who spoke about the most important things. Not directly, not with slogans, but with intonation. This honesty, soft and almost unnoticeable, became her weapon. In a country where every chord went through a filter of approval, she managed to sound as if she could do anything. And no one understood how she didn't organize protests. Because her very sincerity was already a challenge. She did not resist. She existed according to her own laws, in her own truth, in her own song. And even when she was removed from the screens, when they stopped inviting her, when they tried to distract attention from her, people continued to listen because they knew that this was not a decoration, not a facade, not a form. This was a real person and a song with a soul. Her confession never required a spectacle, only silence to be heard for real. When the stage moved away, when the microphone fell silent and the television cameras stopped turning toward her, only a few people remained around her. Not colleagues from posters and not fans seeking autographs, but those who knew the real her, without makeup, without a scarf, without a strong face. Those who brought not flowers, but hot broth. Who did not ask why she no longer sang, but simply sat down next to her and read an old book aloud. Valentina Tolkunova appeared at her house without warning, without theatricality, not as a star, but as a person. She didn't pity her, she just looked and saw that she could still smile. Sometimes she would bring something tasty, sometimes she would just listen. In her silence, there was more support than in any speeches. She did not disappear when the airwaves disappeared. This was her tenderness. Iosif Kobzon, as he later admitted, did not at first understand what was special about her. Neither her voice nor her appearance made an impression. But when he heard her for real, everything changed. He didn't make a gesture of it. He just stayed by her side, without flags, without cameras, reserved but confident. He knew how hard it was to be real in a system that was afraid of sincerity. He understood that her pain was not only personal, but also professional. He couldn't get her back on screen, but he could stay by her side, and he did. There was also Valentina Kotelkina, a childhood friend, a sister not by blood, but by faith. With her, Maya could talk without filters about the past, about her choices, about her fears, about what she could no longer get back. It was she who stood by her side when the most difficult days began, not as a helper, but as a part of her life with whom she didn't have to explain anything. Valentina remembered her voice when it was still clear and accepted her whisper when it became the only way to say, "I'm here." And, of course, there was her sister Anna. She didn't ask why Maya was silent more and more often. She just brought tea, smoothed the bed, and opened the window when it started to rain. She held her hand when others no longer knew what to say. Not because she had to, but because it was impossible to do otherwise. These people did not come into her life at the very end. They were there when the applause disappeared, when the spotlights went out, when the audience dispersed. They were not afraid of her weakness. They remembered her strength and preserved it in conversations, in laughter, in her favorite linden tea. Not as a singer, but as the real Maya. If her body had not begun to crumble so early, if it hadn't been for that diagnosis that cut everything short just as it was beginning, her name would have, perhaps, sounded differently. Louder, on a larger scale. There was something in her voice that did not require embellishments, fountains, ballet, or complex arrangements. Only music and truth. It was a rare gift not just to sing, but to live the song. She was loved for her intonations, for her sincerity, for the feeling that in every verse she was talking to you personally, directly, for real. Composers wanted to write for her. Directors listened to her voice and wondered, what if we give her a role? There was a theatricality in her manner of performance, not a deliberate one, but an internal one. She could say one phrase in such a way that a whole scene could be seen behind it. She could have been an actress, intimate, subtle, and alive. She could have hosted shows, not just shows, but real conversations, where not only the questions were important, but also the silence between them. Her timbre was made for radio, for cinema, for poetry, for voice acting, where the voice is a world. But everything that could have been remained only in drafts, in dreams, in notebooks on a desk. In the early 80s, she was still making plans. She wanted to record an album of romances, to create a solo program where each song would sound like a confession. She was looking for young musicians, writing a script for an intimate evening with poetry. She hoped to find a small hall where she could perform without regard for airtime. She still believed she would return, not to the screen, but to the audience, without falsehood, without conditions. Just her voice and her. But the disease returned again, unexpectedly, without warning, as always. And everything that had been written remained in the desk drawer. But even so, she remained, because her songs continued to sound, because the thousands of letters she kept in a box proved that she was remembered, because women all over the country tied scarves, not knowing that they were not copying an image, but a strength. And even though she did not become a show host, did not act in a movie, did not open a theatrical evening, she still became a symbol, not of an era, but of the heart, and that is forever. She passed away quietly as she had lived, without cameras, without newspaper headlines, without lines for a farewell. She was not escorted with fanfare, not carried on lacquered shoulders with theatrical speeches. Everything happened almost unnoticed, as if the light had simply gone out in a room where it had been warm. But those who knew her did not forget. Those who heard her voice even once could not erase it from their memory, because it didn't just sound, it remained. She left no biographies written on commission, no films with meaningful phrases were released. Only recordings with rustles, with clicks, with the atmosphere of those years remained. And in these recordings, she is alive, real, and unbroken. Her voice does not age. It is not subject to time, because it was never fashionable. It was truthful, and truth does not need an era. When you turn on her song, especially the one where "and finally I will say" sounds, it's as if a door opens, and for a moment, she returns. Not for the sake of the stage, not for the sake of applause, but for the sake of being heard again. Her voice is gone, her body is gone, but her soul remained in every intonation, in every breath between the lines, in every silence after the last words. She didn't leave, she just went out for a short time, and she returns every time someone turns on her song, not for a mood, but for memory. Not for background, but for the heart. Because there are voices that do not disappear. They just wait for a moment to sound again. And as long as her name is heard, she is there, even if in a whisper.